Throughout the last half of the 20th century, the United States was almost constantly involved in the Cold War, a conflict between the United States in which we were competing with Russia for everything as far as economic value, technological value, or just general power. Now, while this didn't actually lead to an armed conflict, it led to a stark rivalry which pushed both countries to greater and greater heights and allowed for some of our greatest progress of the 20th century. Now, when we look at the current state of China, we can see a very similar situation in which China over the last 10 years has had an economy that has been booming beyond any other economy in the world. And it is starting to have attention noticed across the world, as the United States is now noticing China as a country that may either help it or end up hurting it. Now, when we pose the question, will China's economic prowess eventually lead to a future friendship or hatred with the United States, we need to understand that the United States and China will eventually become foes. Now, this is for two different reasons. First, because China's economic gain is actually going to cause a conflict in ideology. And secondly, because China's economic gain is actually going to cause materialistic conflicts with the United States. By looking at these two viewpoints, we can see how, whether we like it or not, the United States and China will eventually become rivals, just as the United States and Russia did in the last half of the 20th century. Now, along with this economic progress that China has had, it has had to take several measures to establish itself as a world power. And in doing so, this is going to obviously lead to a conflict in ideology between what we believe in the United States. And we can see this by looking at two different situations. We can first look at what China is doing to hold its power in its own country, and secondly, by looking at what it's doing to its citizens and how this will conflict to United States ideals. According to a BBC News report of December 17, 2007, China now has the second largest economy in the world, with a gross domestic product of $5.33 trillion. Now, while this may just simply seem like a number, it's actually much more, as it significantly places them in second place only behind the United States. Now, while this may be a very prosperous thing for the country, it's also forcing them to exude their power in any opportunity necessary. As according to an International Herald Tribune article from January 7, 2008, China is now having to take the defensive and is lashing out at any country that challenges them in any way. Simply put, they see their economic status as a place that they need to defend in any way possible. And obviously, this is going to lash out against the United States. Now, at the same time, China is being forced to oppress its citizens because it feels that's what it needs to do in order to keep its economic growth going. And we can see this by first looking at a Washington Post article from January 3, 2008, which reports that along with the censorship that China has had for years over its newspapers, it is now actually beginning to censor the internet, coming up with its own internet providers so that Chinese citizens are not allowed to look at anti-Chinese propaganda on the internet. Now, at the same time, it's beginning to oppress such islands as Hong Kong as well, as we look at an Economist article from January 3, 2008, which reports that China has now placed limitations on Hong Kong, which prevents them from holding a general election for its own leader until 2017. In essence, China is limiting its citizens more and more simply because it feels its economic growth is vital to the limitations of these citizens. And the United States obviously does not appreciate this, as we stand for freedom, freedom of the press, and freedom of our lives. Obviously, this mix and ideology is going to cause a conflict between these two countries. However, along with the conflict of ideology, there is bound to be some sort of conflict between materialism, as the United States and China are both going to be competing for the world market. And we can see just how clear this is by first looking at the conflict in environmental values, and secondly, by looking at how this conflict is going to affect the global market and both countries' economies. The United States over the last 5 years has obviously taken a swing towards environmental progressiveness. We have tried to do everything from eliminate bad water to cure the carbon emissions in our atmosphere. However, China has not been participating, and we can see this by looking at exactly what they're doing to help prevent the problem. China's environmental instincts have always been somewhat of a joke. And if we look at a New York Times article from January 22nd, 2008, we can see just how much of a joke they are. As we look at what they did with one of their most famous hillsides, the coal emissions from their plants had been turning it brown, so they decided to spray paint the hillside green to make it look better. Obviously, this is something different than what Americans believe. And obviously, it's going to cause a conflict between what they want us to do and what we want them to do. Now, at the same time, they're directly going to affect our global market as well. As according to an Economist article from January 17, 2008, China is now creating its own car companies and its own car dealerships. And not only is this affecting their country, but it's affecting ours as well, as they are now attempting to sell their cars in the United States. Now, while a free market may be good, this is having a direct effect on our economy. As according to an International Herald Tribune article from January 16, 2008, China has now passed the United States as the leading exporting nation throughout the world. In essence, their economy is surpassing ours, and this is obviously going to cause many United States citizens to be angry in our economic condition that we're in right now. So in posing the question, will China's eventual economic success cause them to be a friend or foe of the United States? We need to realize that they are going to be a foe. And this is for two main reasons. First, because their economic success is going to cause a shift in ideology. And secondly, because this economic success is going to cause materialistic conflicts with Americans. So while we may have never been great friends with China, we need to realize that this relationship is only going to get worse as the rivalry builds to something that's almost as big as ours with Russia.